150 years before around the 1970s, Americans had enjoyed a rising standard of living because they were paid higher wages. Corporations were doing very well. There weren't enough workers around, so to get workers to come, often from other countries, and to get workers to stay in jobs, you had to pay them more every year, even if it was a little, but it grew. And people could afford a rising standard of living out of their wages. In the 1970s, that stopped. American corporations moved their jobs abroad. American corporations substituted computers for people. Women looking for an equal position with men started working in jobs much more than they had before. And for all these reasons, employers didn't have to pay rising wages anymore, and they took advantage of that situation and stopped. The real wage, that is the money you earn per hour of work, today in the United States is about what it was in the middle of the 1970s. Wages stopped going up. But meanwhile, the hopes of the American people to enjoy the American dream, to give their kids a college education, to live in a decent way, to be able to take a vacation, all those things kept going. And the costs of them kept rising. Not only that, producers in America, corporations, pumped up the advertising, telling everybody how they ought to live, what a good standard of living, what a successful American life meant. Moreover, there was no discussion in America about what it meant and whether it was legitimate for corporations to take advantage of the labor market and not raise wages the way they had. Even though the workers were becoming more productive, they didn't get any more. We had no public discussion about it. We had no policy about it. So every American family handled it individually. And one of the things American families did was to borrow money. To keep up with the American dream, to provide for their kids, the promises they had made, they borrowed money. And they borrowed in a way they had never done before. And for the last 25 years, that's how the American economy was sustained, by borrowed money used by people who no longer had rising wages to pay for it. Now the American people are tapped out. Their wages haven't gone up, and they can't borrow anymore because they can't sustain the debts they already have.
What the employer has been giving you for the last 50 years has gone nowhere. But what you give to the employer has zoomed up by a third. That's why there's a gap between rich and poor in the United States. Working people, their incomes have gone nowhere. But the employer class, a small minority in this country, has made out like the bandits that capitalism makes them be.
All right, so thanks again to all of y'all for coming out. We are going to go ahead and get started. It's really great to see a lot of new faces and a lot of new names. This is our first ever political education series, so it's really exciting for us. And once again, thank you all for coming out. My name is Robert. I am the treasurer for the Charlottesville chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. I'm also part of the Socialist Night School working group that developed tonight's session. The purpose of Socialist Night School is to provide a forum for members of the community, as well as members of our own chapter, to learn about topics related to socialism and to discuss how we can apply this shared history and theory to the world that we currently live in. Future sessions of Socialist Night School will include primers on Marxism that dive a bit deeper into some of the concepts that we're going to be presenting tonight, as well as various other topics related to socialist history, abolition, intersections with identity and culture. If you want to receive updates on future sessions, we will have an opportunity at the end of this meeting to add your email to our mailing list so you can get updates on future sessions. If you have any ideas or suggestions for future sessions, you're more than welcome to get in touch as well. So before I introduce tonight's facilitators, I just want to go over some protocols and guidelines that will help things go as smoothly as possible. There will be two small group discussions that will last around 10 minutes each. There will also be moments during the presentation where you will have a chance to talk. If you would like to speak, just type the word stack into the chat. That's S-T-A-C-K. This will determine the order that people get to speak, with priority given to individuals from marginalized groups and people who have not yet had the chance to speak. So we just ask that you please be polite and respectful of others' opinions and be conscious of the time that you take up so that others who want to participate can get a chance to do so. While the facilitators are speaking, we will have everyone on mute. So if you have a question during that time, we just ask that you type it in the chat. And the last thing I want to add is that we give everyone the benefit of the doubt that you are here in good faith. If you've just come, however, to debate and to lecture why socialism is bad, then we politely ask that you leave. If you choose not to abide by these simple requests, then we will have to boot you from the session. We don't take lightly the safety and security of everyone here. So without further ado, I'm going to pass things over to tonight's facilitators, Griffin and Emma, so they can introduce themselves.
Hi, my name's Emma. I'm a member of Cville DSA. I worked with Griffin on today's presentation. Griffin, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure, my name's Griffin, and besides being involved with Charlottesville DSA, I'm a student at UVA.
Awesome. Then I think we can go ahead and get started. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. We've got a presentation put together for today. So you're going to be looking at some imagery for the entirety of this presentation. So let's just get that all set. All right. So welcome to Socialist Night School, our first session on Socialism 101. We're going to be talking about socialism today and all of the basics, the theory, a little bit of history. But before we get into all of that, we thought it might make sense to start by talking about what we think socialism is the better alternative to, namely capitalism. And I know you probably didn't come here because you wanted to talk about capitalism. Maybe you did, but we're going to start the conversation off by trying to figure out what is capitalism exactly. We know that it's an economic and political system, but what does it look like? How does it work? And at this point, if there's anyone who wants to offer, if you want to put yourself in stack and offer any ideas on what you think capitalism is, if you want to give your own definition, we can take some comments right now. And I think if you're looking for how to get to the chat from the full screen menu, you can go to more and then it's chat in the drop down menu. And maybe while you're figuring that out or trying to think about what capitalism means to you, can you think of a high pressure industry? Does anyone have an example of an industry or workplace that's high stress or high pressure? Okay, a restaurant industry. So what is it? Or being an air traffic controller. Yeah, that's a great point. So what is it about, what is it about these industries that makes them stressful? Let's go ahead and stick with Wall Street, for example. Why do Wall Street bankers or stockbrokers feel so much stress every day? What kind of things contribute to that being a stressful environment? Okay, things that are fast-paced, right? Yeah, being a sailor, very fast-paced. Uncertainty, yeah, so So there's sort of a pressure to compete, to kind of keep up with all of the demands, to be ahead of everyone else. You know, even if you're just a sailor and things are competitive, or not necessarily directly competitive, you're feeling a lot of high pressure to keep up with the demands that are being put on you by your employer. Yeah, it involves trying to increase your income every day. So a lot of the high pressure in a lot of these industries comes down to the need to constantly be turning a profit. Great. So if we think turning a profit is one element of capitalism, and one thing that makes it so stressful for a lot of workers, does anyone have any other associations with capitalism they want to drop? You're welcome to keep dropping stuff in the chat. I think that's working pretty well. Hearing power, inequality. All right. I think that's a good intro. Let's go ahead and work through a definition together here. So capitalism, as we know, it's an economic system. Specifically, it's an economic system in which goods and services, also known as commodities, are bought and sold for a profit. So that's the high stakes here of a lot of these industries, is trying to keep a profit. It's also an industry where the means of production are privately owned and monopolized by a few. So the means of production here, that can be everything from factories in the traditional sense to land, raw materials, the workplace in general. That is not something that the workers own under a capitalist system. Furthermore, workers are exploited, which means that they're producing more value than they are getting in wages. You know, you're working your butt off, hauling cargo every day on your sailboat, but you're not seeing most of the profits that are coming from your labor. Lastly, capitalism is a system where there's a monetary system that produces bank credit money and debt. Under capitalism, I saw that power and inequality were also mentioned. Economic power purchases political power such that the ownership class, which we also call the ruling class, is able to use their control over production and industry to sort of advocate for their own private interests. You can probably think of some examples. I think corporate lobbyists is maybe the easiest one to come up with, but this is even the case when you think about, like, if you want to access the legal system, if you want to file a lawsuit, that costs money. And so the kinds of people who are able to influence politics through the legal system also tend to have economic resources. But I'm sure you can think of your own examples as well. All right, so that's capitalism as we're seeing it for the purposes of this presentation. We're not going to go into a history of capitalism for this because we're more interested in socialism, which we think is going to be a much more useful topic of discussion. So we know that socialism presents itself as an alternative to capitalism. Socialism is interested in sort of addressing and remedying some of the injustices that come from a capitalist system. So what else do you know about socialism? What kind of associations do you have? What did you learn in school? What does socialism mean to you? And again, you can either drop something in the chat or type stack if you want to speak. Okay, so I'm hearing like increased equality, collective ownership. Okay, so we talked about how under capitalism, things are owned by a small group of an ownership class. Yeah, so ownership is no longer put into private hands. Yeah, and then often we have it associated with Russia. That's probably what most people learned in high school. Maybe if you had a world history class, you learned about socialism in the Soviet Union at the same time, which of course has its own complicated history that we don't necessarily get taught very well in American schools. All right, so I'll go ahead and go through the definition we've got. So socialism is a social, economic, and political system in which the means of production are owned collectively by everyone. A couple people mentioned this in the chat. Furthermore, socialism is a democratic system. Democracy is going to be the way that the workplace is governed, as well as in the political sphere. So democratizing the workplace. Goods and services are going to be produced according to want and need, so not according to profit. So it's not about producing what's profitable, making things because you get a high profit margin off of it. It's we're going to make this because this is what society wants. This is what people need. And additionally, everyone in a socialist system should have access to and a right to social goods that guarantee their well-being. So this is everything from housing. Everyone should have a right to safe, high-quality housing, to childcare, education, healthcare, etc. So socialism criticizes capitalism specifically, and then organizes the people who suffered under capitalism, namely the workers, into political parties, unions, and other organizations in order to fight capitalist oppression. So you might be thinking, why socialism? Maybe I don't like capitalism. What specifically does socialism have to offer as an alternative to democracy? First of all, socialism is a highly democratic alternative. It aims to democratize the political, economic, and cultural spheres, as well as protecting and guaranteeing civil rights. Socialism is a democracy-focused alternative to capitalism, wants to put power into the hands of the working class and the people who don't have a voice under capitalist systems. Key to this idea is the fact that capitalism itself is at odds with the idea of democracy. So an economic system that places power and control in the hands of the ruling class cannot adequately represent the needs of all of its people. Socialism aims to dismantle capitalism and replace it with real functioning democracy in which everyone has a voice. And so by eliminating the profit motive, socialism hopes to build a world in which the environment isn't harvested and polluted for profit, which, as you probably have noticed, capitalists love to do, and oppression in all of its forms is rooted out. So that is the sort of quick introduction to concept of socialism. We're going to spend a little bit of time going into some basic history, and Griffin is going to take it over from here. And Griffin, you could just tell me slide when you want to switch slides.
Thanks very much. So I guess to preface this section of the presentation, we just talked about what capitalism is. We just talked about what socialism is. But socialism is a tradition that goes back, more than a century. And we're just going to run through some of the ideas in the history that has led us to the resurgence of socialism in the present moment. And it's an additional point. I think it's important to say that there have been as many unique ideas about what socialism means or how we get it as there have been individual socialists. We can only touch on a few figures and moments and concepts in this presentation, but there are lots of points of departure which will hopefully aid you in your own learning about socialism after the presentation. So, the first socialists, sort of people who called themselves that, appeared in the early 1800s. And socialism as an idea emerged out of the political fights in the American, French, and Haitian revolutions, where people looked at They're societies in which they were ruled by kings and large landowners, or a foreign occupying slave power. And they said, this is unjust. We need representative governments. And they also saw the increased development of large-scale industrial manufacturing that took off in what's called the Industrial Revolution. So lots of people are going from working the land to gathering in city centers, and suddenly everyone is working in one large building, very long hours, dangerous machinery, low pay, and people saw where society was headed and thought, I'm morally opposed to this. I'm a socialist. And some of the first ideas people had about how to build socialism was, this is where industrial society is going. We should try to found our own communities and build another type of life. These people eventually were called utopian socialists by some. And there's a picture of a few of them at the bottom, like the Saint-Simonians, the Fourierists, and followers of Robert Owen, the Owenites. Initially, they started out in Europe, but some of them came to America, and they came up with really elaborate plans for how their communities would be designed. We're going to go live in the woods, and then we'll build a dormitory here, and a clubhouse here, and a production house here, and everyone's going to work, this group of people will work 4 hours on these goods, and these people during this part of the day will be assigned cleaning duties, and everything would fit into its neat little place such that they would have a little society within the larger society where, instead of working for someone else and making something that you don't even see the benefits of, you're contributing to a community in which you're living in harmony with other people. The US had almost 100 of these communities, actually. It's really interesting history to learn about all throughout the country. But it was sort of a trend that eventually flared out because, if all of society is pushing in one direction and you and your friends and a few groups of families try to, start up a new system within the other one, you can only advance so far without a lot of resources. And so this is why people turn to political struggle as the way to advance socialism, which I think brings us to the next slide. This is an example of one of these communities. It's a depiction based on the plans. In this particular case, the really grand buildings that they wanted everyone to live in were called phalanxes. And everyone would live in one big building, everyone would have their own room, the units would be identical, and everyone would see themselves as equal to each other, working for the betterment of the community. Right, so around the middle of the 1800s, people's main ideas about socialism start to change. And this is because there are a series of revolutions all across Europe, in which one of the main political actors are the industrialized workers, the new people who had come from the countryside or who had stopped being artisans and sort of making things out of their own home, who had come to work in factories and manufacturing, sort of acted together as a group in these large political conflicts where old aristocratic systems were swept away and replaced with less feudal and more representative governments. And Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were two people who sort of formalized this trend and turned it into a political theory. So they studied politics, economics, and history, and they concluded that the working class is the group in society who must build socialism. They paid a lot of attention to the upheavals that were going on in their time, including the Civil War. There's correspondence between Marx and Lincoln because they thought the defeat of the Confederacy was a big advance for working people of all colors in the United States. And they saw workers acting together out of self-interest and thought that this presupposed the political actor who has the power to win socialism as against the small minority of people who run the governments and the businesses. So socialism, just to rephrase some things we've already talked about, it's a system that's our moral goal, and Marxism is an analysis that provides us with concrete ways to advance towards it. So now we're just going to run over some concepts that you will hear if you're around socialists a lot, that descend from the initial writings of Marx and Engels. Of course, this is very simplified, and there's much more vocabulary that we could go over, but I think it helps to have these big ones as ways to orient our thinking. So the means of production, as has already been brought up, are sort of like the inputs for producing economic value: factories, stores, goods, other things like this. Things that, if you have a job, you don't necessarily own, but are nonetheless part of the process by which you either create a product or sell a product. So ultimately, the company or the business owner owns it, but it's not human labor. Then there's the relations of production, which refers to the social structure in society. So, at the time when they were first writing, the social structure was more mixed than it was now. There were many more farmers. Lots of people, made goods in small scale ways, like artisans. There were people who were still peasants. There was, of course, slavery. But today, the dominant relation of production is the fact that people sell their labor for a living to earn a wage. So you have basically one group of people who work and one group of people who own the resources and who employ those people, which brings us to the next concept, the working class and the ruling class, those who work for a living versus those who profit off of others. If you've gotten a hint of what we've been talking about, it might occur to you that those two groups of people can't necessarily always see eye to eye on certain political issues, which brings us to the idea of class interests. So, there are policies or there are things that can happen in society that would benefit workers. There are things that would benefit capitalists or the people in government. And there are, policies that might appeal to middle class people, might appeal to people who own homes, might appeal to those who are unemployed. But one way to think about the world is, okay, a politician is proposing this. Who does it help? Who does it hurt? Who is likely to support it? Who is likely to oppose it, and how strongly? And then another group of terms is, of course, socialism and communism. The way Marx uses these, although he uses them differently in some ways, or in some different texts, I should say, is that socialism is the stage when the working class has taken political control of society, and they start to provide the goods and services that everyone has as basic needs, like healthcare, housing, where production is initially, it starts out privately owned, it becomes more publicly owned. And, there are still people who oppose that in society, the people who previously owned the means of production. But there's also starting to be the development of producing goods and having services in the interest of the working class for people's needs and wants. And then communism is sort of like the far off utopian end goal, where ultimately we want a society without these sort of class distinctions, where people's needs are met. We work as little as possible to satisfy everyone's wants as we collectively decide them. And there are no distinctions between you and me in the United States and someone on the other side of the world, hopefully. Socialism then is the transition, the first step towards this end state, or the sort of ideal of communism. So yeah, just to run through a few more concepts. So there's a line from the Communist Manifesto, which is of course one of the most famous things that Karl Marx has written, where he says, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. So sort of like thinking about class interests, this is a way to orient how we think about politics. And he sort of saw that the way that societies change over time, how their structures of government change, how people win the right to vote, how people's lives become easier or more difficult at a given moment, how wars break out or how they're finished. It's really about, are the rich people in control and defending their property, or are working people, poor people, peasants, slaves at the time, people who don't have jobs, are they getting together and are they stronger than that minority of people who currently run society? And so in illustrating this idea of history being the history of class struggle, he talks about the development in stages of the way societies are economically run, from feudalism, where you, as a laborer in agriculture, work for someone who owns the land, and you have no rights to the produce, the products of your labor. You're given as much might feed your family, but beyond that, your life prospects are kind of confined to the gated area where you might work for someone who has a castle. Which becomes capitalism, where for once there is some amount of social mobility, and in a way people have won many democratic rights, and they're no longer subject to the individual domination of a feudal lord, but instead the main relation that governs society is working for a boss. And then predicting into the future, Marx thought beyond capitalism there would be socialism, where we collectively decide what to make and how to distribute it. So again, the defining feature, as Emma brought up earlier, of capitalism is economic exploitation. Workers produce more value than they receive. That difference is called profits, and one of the ideas behind socialism is that it should be distributed equitably as opposed to hoarded by the rich people. And then the Communist Manifesto ends with the slogan, "Workers of the world unite." And this idea has inspired the internationalism of the socialist movement ever since it began, because you or me in the United States, Karl Marx thought, have less in common with the people running our society than someone who works for a wage in another country. And at the time there were lots of wars over territory in Europe, and in trying to assemble a coalition to make these wars stop and win more democratic governments and ultimately peace, they deduced that the only way that we can win peace and not be sent to the trenches to fight each other is if working people in different countries saw their interests as more similar than those of the wealthy in their own society. And so this is the spirit that informs a lot of the internationalism of the socialist movement, which is very key. And it's reflected in the idea that communism as the final end goal is a society without borders. So just to name some of the political tendencies where people can disagree within the socialist movement. So communist society, as we've said before, is one where all of these distinctions between people on the basis of the nation they live in, or whether what industry they happen to work in, are gone, and people are, as much as can be sort of achieved, equal, and society is totally governed by the meeting of people's collective needs and wants. Socialism is the stage to get there, where there is some state to facilitate the distribution of goods and the redistribution of wealth. Now, a term that you'll be familiar with if you stick around in DSA is anarchism. And so anarchism, as against communism or socialism, is a different approach to how to achieve socialism. It rejects using the state in order to overcome all of these hierarchies, because it believes that these bureaucracies that we see in government currently and within corporations have a tendency to reproduce themselves if you participate in politics in this way. And so they reject some of the things that people who call themselves socialists or communists engage in as impediments to personal liberation and true freedom. Now, as the point at the bottom of the slide says, these are the disagreements between anarchists and socialists and communists are disagreements about how to get to the common goal of communism. So we started in the early 1800s, then we went to the mid 1800s, but by the late 1800s, in the early 20th century, the workers' movements in Europe had become really quite strong. They were outlawed in some places, but then they were so strong that they were able to become legal again. And the ruling classes all over Europe really feared the socialist movement. The socialist movement was called social democracy. That's sort of the official term that they used. The idea being that to the extent that their current governments are democracies, we want them to be democracies over the whole of society. We want to introduce democracy into the workplace and the economic sphere. And the way they did this was by taking a conscious approach to merging the socialist movement with the labor movement and the working class movement, such that these parties became really, really large. They were winning more and more votes and getting more and more people elected. And this is true in the United States as in Europe. But then with the start of World War I, there was a split in the socialist movement, the results of which are in a way still with us today. And the split was over whether or not World War I and the socialist governments, the socialist home governments should be supported in that conflict. Some saw that the war was being fought in the interests of bankers and industrialists and kings and princes and presidents, and that the people who were actually fighting the war were the sons of workers, and so that therefore the war had to be opposed at all costs. And others thought that some countries were more progressive than others, and it would really be a detriment to the local movement if their country was invaded and taken over by a foreign power. And so the approach to World War I, do we oppose it vigorously? Do we hesitantly support our own government's military actions, led to the socialist movement, then called social democracy, splitting into social democrats on the one hand and communists on the other hand. This split led to the founding of new parties all over the world, as well as prolonged strategic differences between social democrats and communists. And it persisted throughout the Cold War. So where before you had a social democratic party, the socialist movement was all one. Now you had two parties. You had the Socialist Party, or the Social Democrats, and the Communists. And they disagreed about how to relate to taking power. Some of them thought you make alliances with liberal parties or progressives. And the others thought we must reject that entirely and we shouldn't even participate in elections because our goal is to overthrow the state and make a revolution. And so some of the differences we talked about between socialists and anarchists, these are some of the differences between historically socialists and communists. But it's important, right? Because with the Russian Revolution, right after World War I, the communists had a lot of appeal because they had ended the war in that country and had taken power and were able to use that victory to make the case to other socialists that they should abandon the so-called reformist path, or the path of conciliation with their governments. And so this is condensing a lot more history than the previous sections, but the split that we just talked about was around until basically the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s. But that wasn't the only thing that sort of dominated the ideas and practice of socialism in the Soviet Union. In reality, political upheavals continued throughout the Cold War. And they mainly took the form of kicking advanced capitalist countries out of parts of Latin America, out of parts of Africa, out of parts of Asia, and winning national liberation for those countries such that you weren't being ruled over by diplomats from somewhere in Europe or someone in America. And so there's a variety of pictures down at the bottom of the slide to illustrate some of the examples of these anti-colonial revolutions. One of them was in Chile, where Salvador Allende won power. One of them is a picture of Thomas Sankara, where there was a revolution in Burkina Faso in the 80s. One of these pictures is of Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, of course, the Cuban Revolution, which is another one of the sort of defining points of communism during the Cold War. And then, without knowing exactly, I think this other one is a picture of the Iranian communist parties, where, of course, the oil resources, the Egyptian Communist Party, okay. But there were similar, right? So there were conflicts between the peoples in a given country and the imperialists, who, in the case of the Middle East or North Africa, were really interested in maintaining control of the oil reserves there. And so, in the same way that feudalism developed to capitalism, one of the ways that these societies progressed was from being governed by outsiders to governing themselves. So this story so far has mostly been about other parts of the world. But it's, we shouldn't forget that socialism is just as much a phenomenon native to the United States as it is to anywhere else. So the Socialist Party in the early 1900s was a truly mass multiracial movement. They ran Eugene Debs for president 5 times. They had nearly 1,000 elected officials all over the country and thousands and thousands of members. Then, like I said, when there was this split between Social Democrats and communists, the Communist Party was founded in 1921, and it played a really key role in organizing workers for radical change during the Great Depression, and I think was one of the actors who really convinced elites to deliver the New Deal at the time as relief during the sort of really profound economic recession. And American socialists have fought for sort of any progressive issue you might imagine in our history. Socialists have been there fighting for it. So women's suffrage, against lynching, against wars like the Vietnam War, and for economic democracy in the forms of more union representation and worker control of businesses. For a reference point, DSA today has over 75,000 members, chapters in every state, and 100 plus elected officials. So if anyone ever tries to tell you that socialism it works in other places but not here, or the idea comes from somewhere else and it can't work in this country, just point them to the long tradition we have of proudly fighting for socialism in the United States. This is a picture of Eugene Debs, who was the presidential candidate of the Socialist Party that I mentioned in the previous slide. He's quite worked up, as you can see, delivering a speech to tons and tons of people, which I think speaks to just how much of a mass movement and really big phenomenon this was in US society. Socialists all over the country, they drew crowds wherever they went. There were tons and tons of socialist newspapers and clubs and sports leagues. So it was not just a political phenomenon, it was also a cultural movement that had something to offer for every part of someone's life. And then here's a picture of members of the Communist Party marching to demand equal rights for Black Americans and to tell the government to crack down on lynching. The Communist Party was especially effective at making inroads with poor Black workers who, as we might guess, because of discrimination throughout society, especially in the past, were not always looked to as political actors in their own right. And so, especially in the South, but also in big civil rights cases, the Communist Party was quite integrated with Black Americans.
Great. I think we're now going to go ahead and move to our breakout room discussion. So you've heard a little bit from us. We've done some talking. We're hoping you can now sort of reflect on some of the information that you've taken in when we send you off into breakout rooms. So the questions that we're hoping to discuss in our breakout rooms are sort of reflect on some of the urgent problems that you've been thinking about. What are some of the things that brought you to this meeting, for example? What do you think is wrong with the world right now? There's a lot to choose from, so hopefully you'll all have something to say. And how does that relate to capitalism? And then how do you see socialism as we've just presented it to you? What kind of solutions do you think the socialist vision can offer to some of those contemporary urgent issues? So we're going to go on to breakout rooms. Please just remember the rules for discussion that we mentioned at the top of this presentation. So be polite, be aware of how much time you're taking up, and say everything in good faith. Not here for a debate club. There will be other opportunities in the internet for that, for you, if that's what you want. But yeah, I think we can go ahead and break out into those discussions. Right. I think there might still be a breakout group out, but maybe while we're waiting for the last groups to come back in, we don't need every breakout group doesn't need to share, but did anyone want to sort of chime in and talk about like a highlight of the discussion or something that you thought was noteworthy? Drop it in the chat or type stack and we can have you share. Democracy in the workplace. Yep. That's really, really important to a lot of people, understandably. And I think today in particular, I know that UVA announced their campus union today. So I imagine the issue of democracy in the workplace is on a lot of people's minds today. Awesome. Yeah. Oh, that's great. And this ties into some of the discussion we'll get into later, so that's perfect. So sort of the, what does it look like in practice question. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, I think we can go ahead and sort of move on. So we had our little discussion on the goals of socialism, sort of talking about kind of how we came to be interested in the topic, what kind of things are important to us, what issues are important to us, and what we think that can look like. I think when you're talking about socialism generally, there are a couple of different goals that come up repeatedly, and of course there are lots of other goals that we could attribute to the movement. But I think these are some of the common ones. So democracy in the workplace and democracy in the government. I think democracy in the workplace, like we said, definitely came up in some of these breakout groups. And then collective ownership over the means of production. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but that just goes to eliminating sort of the private monopolization of all of the goods and services and the things that create them. And then the other thing that will come up over and over again is an elimination of systemic oppression, because the goal for socialism isn't just to make a better, more just economic system, which of course is the goal. But the reason that's the goal is because the economic system we have right now oppresses us. And it's that oppression that we're trying to undo. So we talked a little bit about the history of socialism earlier. And Griffin mentioned a little bit about what socialism in the United States has looked like historically. I want to just take a second to touch on socialism today. So over the last decade, more than a decade, depends on how you count it, there's been a little bit more popularity for some of the political leftist movements in Europe and Latin America. And importantly for us, socialism has started to become mainstream in ways that it hadn't been for a long time in the United States. So we're starting to see socialist ideas surface in a lot of different contexts. One that we could start with is the 2011's Occupy Wall Street movement. For a lot of people, this is an important sort of introduction to class interests and class politics. This was a movement that was focused on wealth inequality, it was focused on corruption at the highest levels, and sort of this idea of the 99% versus the 1%, which is really building sort of a working class consciousness in that movement. I know some of you probably mentioned this in your breakout groups, that Bernie Sanders is also sort of an example of socialism and democratic socialist ideas entering the mainstream. I think the first campaign in particular really showed that there is an audience for these kind of ideas on the national scale. There's a mass audience for it. The last one I wanted to mention is the Black Lives Matter movement. So in addition to the growing support for open class politics in Occupy Wall Street or in Bernie Sanders' campaign, the Black Lives Matter movement has done a lot to spread leftist ideas throughout our country, pointing out the injustices of systemic racism and police brutality, which are, of course, things that socialists have an interest in as well. And if at this point you're wondering, okay, what does socialism have to do with social justice specifically? We have a slide for you on that. So as we've talked about, the goal of socialism is going to be a radically democratic society that guarantees equality for everyone, including valuing voices of historically and systemically oppressed people. So to that effect, socialism has a strong interest in and has lots of intersections in social justice movements. And while it's definitely an oversimplification to say that something like racism is rooted in capitalist evils entirely, we can say that capitalism exacerbates and enables oppression of the culturally marginalized. So Black socialists, socialist feminists, other socialists with interests in social justice and identity have pointed out that cultural and economic oppression are two forms of oppression that are interlinked. You can't necessarily separate those out entirely, and they do play off of each other. So one example of this that we could talk about is policing. So this is something that's been in the national conversation lately, rightfully so. As many people have pointed out, policing has its roots in the protection of the ruling class and the protection of the ruling class's control over the means of production. It's worth stressing that the American police in particular trace their origins to runaway slave patrols, that many of their strategies and tactics came from imperialist paramilitary operations, that the racist and violent enforcement of property and this ruling class conception of what property is, that is really at the core of policing. So this is made especially obvious when you hear about, for example, violent protesters violent, I'm putting in air quotes here, who are committing violence against property. And you'll hear about that in the media as if it's somehow equal to the violence that policing has committed against Black and brown communities for generations. Yeah, so in this way, capitalist motives behind policing serve to sort of enable and encourage violence against Black and brown people in our country. Well, everywhere. I shouldn't specify that to the United States exclusively. So socialists want to end not just economic domination, but also racism, sexism, transphobia, all other forms of sort of systemic cultural oppression. And I think socialists need to be careful when they're talking about this to not sort of equivocate different experiences of oppression. I think there's a history of, socialists have sort of learned to move beyond saying that like all oppression is rooted in capitalist oppression. It's not particularly accurate or particularly helpful because oppression, of course, has existed before capitalism. And dissolving capitalism alone is not going to be enough to root out oppression. That said, we as socialists think it's a very necessary first condition for really rooting out oppression is to undo the structure of capitalism that is enabling and enforcing this. So yeah, so that's a little bit on sort of some of the intersections there. And so that's all well and good, but how do we get there? Is I think it sounds like some of the breakout groups started to get to this question a little bit already. And this is going to touch on a little bit of what Griffin was talking about earlier in sort of the divisions that have existed in the left. So there have been disagreements for years now about how to achieve our anti-capitalist utopian society, how to achieve our socialist goals. So some people have advocated for reformist strategies, which is sort of accepting the premise that the government as it exists is imperfect, but we can sort of work within these structures, win economic power, and democratize existing structures. Whereas there's sort of an opposing camp who believes that the existing institutions, they need to be abolished entirely. They're not going to work for working class interests. And then there's sort of the middle road where you can run in elections, work within the government while it exists, but also work on building a mass movement, focus on direct action and non-governmental forms of organizing outside of the halls of power. This is going to be our opportunity to go back into the breakout rooms. So hopefully you'll be able to go back and pick up the discussions where you left off. We're going to be talking about sort of how do we get there, reform or revolution or something else. So yeah, with that, we can go ahead and get back into those breakout groups. All right, so I hope you all had good discussions. I hope you figured out the answer and figured out how it is that we're going to get to socialism, because we need that. We need that info. But yeah, so I think it's worth mentioning that this is a presentation that we're putting on as the DSA, and the DSA in a lot of ways sort of represents some of each of these strategies. Today's democratic socialist movement in the US especially, I think, you have the rhetoric of revolution in groups like Our Revolution supporting Bernie Sanders, but a lot of this direct action sort of focused work is coupled a lot of times with the electoral work as well. So with that, I think we can probably transition to talking about the DSA today. And yeah.
Yeah, so we mentioned democratic, so an organization that's growing and represents is the most recent in a long line of socialist organizations in the United States, fighting for democracy and equality. And I just think it's important to say why we need organizations, and why DSA I think is a good one. So Eugene Debs, the person who we saw a picture of earlier, who was the candidate for president in the early 1900s, he had a saying, "An unorganized socialist is a contradiction in terms." What does that mean? It means it's great if you have these ideas about how society should be morally reorganized, but until you get together with other people and fight for it, they're just going to be ideas in your head. And so you have to form groups with other like-minded people and try to win the things you want. And DSA is one of those organizations today. We've been growing ever sort of at an explosive rate ever since 2016, 2017, after the first Bernie campaign and Donald Trump's inauguration. We have elected officials all over the country, in the House of Representatives, local legislatures, on city councils, our own Michael Payne on Charlottesville City Council. So I'm just going to describe some of the important parts about DSA. So DSA is a big tent organization, and that means that there's no line of the organization. Anyone who vaguely agrees with the sort of principles and goals that we've talked about tonight is absolutely welcome in DSA. And lots of people have different ideas about what socialism means or how we get it. All find DSA to be their political home. And then DSA is democratic and member run. So it's democratic in that we elect our leaders at the national level. There's a convention where the national leadership is elected and where delegates debate what we're going to do over the course of the next year and where to devote our resources from the dues that we pay. And at the local level, we, elect the people who run the chapters and put on various events or are in charge of organizing things. And then DSA is also member run. So there are some staff who, send out the emails and set up the calls. But the majority of the stuff that goes on in DSA is conducted by volunteers, right? And that's important because it means that, the reason we're all doing this is because, we're trying to win, for our own self-interest, right? Like, it would be real nice to have Medicare for all, to have universal health care, and so that's why people take time out of their day to participate in DSA. And that level of democracy and that level of people volunteering to make the organization work is what makes sure that it's, our movement doesn't get co-opted or diverted in various ways, such that the interests of the leaders diverge from the interests of the average member, or, we have to make political compromises that we don't want to. We are free to fight for what we believe without the other considerations that getting money from outside donors or, being beholden to bureaucratic structures would require. And with those descriptions, I hope that you might consider, after hearing tonight about our historic mission and how we want to win it, and join DSA. There's a link right there, dsausa.org/join. There's a sliding scale of dues. You can pay as little as $5 a year. You can pay $5 a month. But for the purposes of getting representation at the national level, and in order to receive a quarterly magazine and email updates, you'll want to go to dsausa.org/join if you can and pay dues.
Awesome. Yeah, so that's DSA. That's how we see DSA as fitting into this picture. But you might be interested in knowing what it looks like on the local level. I know we just went over 9 o'clock, so I hope you'll bear with me here. But I do think it's important to think about, like, what what does the actual action of building socialism look like? Our chapter, our Charlottesville DSA chapter, is engaged in a lot of different things, and you'll see we do work in mutual aid and trying to really advocate for solutions for the community that don't necessarily rely on local government, and that I think kind of fits in one model. But we also have groups that work on electoral advocacy. We have people showing up and being heard at city council meetings regularly, and we really have a presence there as well. So we kind of do it all. And you can see some of the issues that we have groups devoted to in that bulleted list right there. And but it's not just DSA. Like, there are other groups in the area that are working really hard toward the same goals that we have. There's Defund Seville PD. There's a huge quantity of just great mutual aid projects, especially that have popped up in the area in response to the pandemic. We've got Showing Up for Racial Justice, Living Wage Campaign at UVA, and recently official, the UVA United Campus Workers as well. So there's a lot of ways that you can get involved, a lot of groups that are doing the work of fighting back against capitalism. And I think, it's real. It's a real movement. If you want to get involved with Charlottesville DSA specifically, the chapter email is at the bottom there. I think maybe someone will reshare the link to how do you sign up for the chapter, I think. If you want to sign up for the mailing list. Yeah, could someone reshare that link? I'm having a difficulty with it. Awesome. Cool. Yeah, so if you want to join our mailing list, that is how you can do it. But yeah, so there's lots of ways you can get involved. Hope you feel inspired to do so after this presentation. And yeah, please also get in touch if you have an interest in future sessions of Socialist Night School. If there's anything in particular you want to learn about, please let us know. And I believe that is it for this presentation.
So thank you everyone for coming out. Keep an eye out for future editions of Socialist Night School to come shortly. And again, if you want to join Seville DSA, we'd love to have you come organize with us. So thanks a lot. Have a good night, everyone.